So Tenet is Christopher Nolan's most recent film, and more than some of his other films, I feel like I've heard just kind of this general unsatisfaction with the movie watching experience. The first thing is the constantly changing aspect ratios throughout the film. Now, I'm specifically critiquing the non-IMAX experience. Now, I know what you're thinking. You're thinking, but Barrett, IMAX is how Nolan intended. And I'll let you go down that rabbit trail of all the how Nolan intended memes out there. But as you probably noticed throughout the film, different shots bounce between two different aspect ratios. The reason why we get two different aspect ratios is because the film was largely captured in two big camera categories. So they used IMAX cameras and then traditional 65mm cameras. Now, IMAX cameras are great, right? They have a nice large picture, they capture gorgeous information, but their Achilles heel is that they produce a lot of noise when they're filming. And I'm not talking about like film grain digital noise, I'm talking about a lot of audible noise. I heard an interview with Hoyte van Hoytema, who was Nolan's DP, and he said that filming with an IMAX camera is kind of like filming with a generator on your shoulder. Now, I think he might be over-exaggerating a little bit, but you can imagine that if you're getting an intimate dialogue scene, a camera that is that noisy just doesn't quite work. So for scenes where they needed to get on-set audio, they just transitioned over to a traditional 65mm camera and captured it that way. Now, I have zero problems with them honoring those different aspect ratios when it comes to an IMAX experience. But for someone who's either watching it at home or through online streaming, the constant bouncing between aspect ratios is really distracting. Now, I've always believed that the aspect ratio of film is one of the unique tools you have for telling your story. And when I see these aspect ratios changing in the film, I start to try to apply a logic to them. And the problem is, there is no logic there. It literally is just them switching between IMAX cameras and the traditional 65mm. The technology should always serve the story, not the other way around. I think this is a blind spot for the film. Now, the second thing is what I think is the most consistent critique of the film, and that is muddy audio. I heard a lot of people say things like it was difficult to hear the dialogue, it just felt like the mix was off.
The arms trade with the training. Knows how to cover his tracks. Got that shotgun. Bought an intelligence agent.
And here we have to separate, I think, Nolan's intention versus the movie watching experience. So I think Nolan's intention is largely twofold. First of all, not all dialogue needs to be heard, and I can completely agree with this. Sometimes dialogue needs to exist in the background. I've heard Chris refer to this as dialogue as a sound effect. There's a second piece of this, which I believe is where things started to get off the rails, and that is they specifically mixed the film for ideal, well-balanced theaters. Now, while I don't in theory have an issue with them designing the film for that pristine theater experience, this is where intention differs from actual experience. An overwhelming majority of people who wanted to see Tenet in 2020 didn't even have access to an IMAX theater to watch it in. And if you're only focusing on that small percentage of pristine, excellently equipped and calibrated theaters, you're gonna sacrifice a lot of moviegoers' experiences along the way. Now, as surprising as this may seem, the audio is not actually my #1 critique of the film. My #1 critique of the film is what I'm gonna call the mechanics. So whenever we're dealing with a complex world in filmmaking, I think it's helpful to kind of split things out into two categories. The first category being what I'll call emotional intuitiveness. So this means that you're able to watch the film and kind of have this gut feel that you understand what's going on. And the secondary category I might call logical understanding, which means you understand this in a way that you could explain the mechanics of the world to someone else. An example of the difference between these two is there's a scene where the protagonist is getting introduced to the concept of like reverse bullets, right? And we can hear all we want about, you know, what it means to have a bullet in reverse or what it means to have already dropped something. But there's this emotional intuitiveness that happens when we watch a bullet get caught or we watch a bullet get undropped. But here's the problem. In the first 30 minutes of the film, we are constantly talked to and rarely shown. Like here, let me get my notes. In the first 30 minutes of the movie, so we have the opening opera scene, which is great, you know, setting up some of the background, and then what do we get? Dialogue on a boat, we get dialogue with gun, which there's some good stuff going on in there. Then we get dialogue in India. We get kind of a cool bungee jump moment, but that doesn't help us understand the world anymore. We got dialogue that happens in India, then we get dialogue in England, and there we've just burned through 30 minutes of the film. We get talked to so much about the mechanics of the world, but rarely shown. And when it comes to these complex mechanics of the film, showing them is when we actually start to understand them. Let's take that red and blue split room scene as an example. Even with rough dialogue, a lot of sound effects going on, we get to see how the story plays out, right? In these moments, it's hard to even describe what's happening in the scenes, but when you watch it and you experience it, there is an intuitiveness to how the world works. So what happens when you combine a story that's relying too much on dialogue and exposition, and on top of that, really the only priority of the audio mix is for the pristine theater experience? Well, I think you end up with a lot of frustrated, confused audience members. I really hope they make a sequel to Tenet. Now that we understand the mechanics of the world, I think we're set up for some really unique character development, some like mind-bending temporal conflict, and a really intriguing future for the protagonist. And I really love Nolan's take on going backwards in time, not just back in time. So this is where I want to invite you into the conversation, and I'm specifically looking for three things. One, what was your first impression of Tenet after you saw it? So first impression, and then second, how did you see it? What medium? Was it in a theater? Was it IMAX? Was it streaming? And finally, if you have seen it a second time, what were your impressions that second time through? Did your opinions about the film change in any way? If you enjoyed this video, feel free to hit the like button, and if you're not already subscribed, hit that subscribe button and you won't miss any of these future discussions.